Mr. Falcon, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule for this interview as part of a series of interviews that we, Hamiari Media, are doing in partnership with BC SARF as we are approaching the end of our calendar year. First, we would like to congratulate you on your victory as the leader of BC Liberal Party. And although you have been recently elected into this position, we would appreciate it if you let us know what major role BC Liberal Party played in Legislative Assembly of British Columbia during the past Iranian calendar year, meaning since March 2021.
Sure. Well, thank you, Seema, and I really appreciate this opportunity to have a chance to talk to you and through you to a large portion of the Persian population. I'm thrilled to be back as the leader of the BC Liberal Party. As you probably know, in the past, almost 10 years ago now, I was the Deputy Premier and the Minister of Finance. And prior to that, I was Minister of Transportation, Minister of Health. So I've had some experience in different roles. The last 10 years I've spent in the private sector, and with my wife Jessica raising our two daughters, Josephine, who's 12, and Rose, who has just turned 9. And it's been fantastic, and I've loved the opportunity to be home with the family. But I'm returning to politics because of my kids, or at least that generation of children, because I think it's very, very important that we have leadership in this province and in this country that is thinking about decisions that affect the next generation. And so that's the main purpose for coming back. And as I look at the last year, I spent most of the last year competing for the leadership of the party, and I'm pleased that when we completed that and we had the vote for the leader, I was really pleased earlier this year to receive a very, very strong endorsement from the party membership, and I think that's been fantastic. I think as a party over the last year, we've probably, I think, started to do a pretty good job of really holding government to account. I mean, the major job of the official opposition is to, say where the government is not doing things well. And so, as we pointed out, we've got the highest housing prices in the history of our province ever. And that's in spite of the fact that this government, back in 2017, in their very first budget that they introduced a whole bunch of taxes onto the housing sector because they misdiagnosed the problem. They said that the problem was caused by foreigners and that it was, just developers that were making money. And if they just put a bunch of taxes in place, that will fix the problem. Well, here we are, 5 years later, and we can see that that clearly hasn't worked. We've got more expensive housing than we've ever had. And I think that makes it hard for young people in particular to imagine themselves being able to, buy and own their first home. But the same thing with grocery prices. We've seen the same thing with gasoline. Even before the Ukraine war that unfortunately broke out in Europe, British Columbia had the highest gas prices in North America, not just in Canada, but in North America. And they're, 50 cents per liter higher than Alberta. They're 40 cents a liter higher than Ontario. And we've been pointing that out to the government. We've had a premier that's promised since 2018 to do something about that and keep saying that they're looking at it and they'll think about it and all this. But in the meantime, I think British Columbians are really suffering, especially low-income British Columbians that haven't got the ability to support these kind of higher gas prices. So in all of those areas, I think the opposition, the BC Liberals, have done a very good job in pointing out some of the shortcomings in government, but we're also, under my leadership, pointing out what we would do differently. And I think that's really important too, because we want to show what BC Liberals will do that's going to be very different from the NDP. And so, for example, on housing, we're saying we have two major problems. One, the cost of housing, and two, the restricted supply of new housing. And we have to force local governments to do their bit to ensure that we get much more supply of new housing of all kinds, condos, townhomes, single family, where that makes sense. but we've got to just flood the marketplace with a whole bunch more new supply. Because if we don't do that, we're never going to have a situation where there's going to be any affordability. And the other thing that I want to do is look at the housing market through the eyes of a first-time buyer, so that young British Columbians have the confidence to know that they've got a government that's thinking about how they will ever get into housing. And the way I want to do that is look at all of the costs that government imposes on housing and strip away a lot of those costs that act as a barrier to first-time buyers, because I'm very focused on helping people that want to get into the market but just can't, because the barriers are so high. The difficulty of saving up a down payment is so hard, and there's ways that we can provide solutions to that. And that's what I'm excited about doing as the new leader of the BC Liberals. So you know, and revenue neutral carbon tax, we were the government. I was there in 2008 when we introduced North America's very first revenue neutral carbon tax. And what that meant was that every penny that we collected in carbon tax by law had to be returned to the public in the form of lower personal income taxes and lower business taxes. And so we purposefully made the carbon tax a shift, not a tax grab. But unfortunately, the NDP in their first budget changed the law so that they now take all that revenue into government and they spend it however they want. And that's unfortunate, because that makes the higher gas prices even worse for British Columbians, because the government profits off the higher gas prices, but the public gets no benefit because none of that money is being returned to them in the form of lower taxes. So these are the kind of things, Seema, that I will be talking about to British Columbians over the next couple of years. But I also want to add this, because this I think is really important. Our party has to be different too. One thing that's very, very important to me is that this party must become much more diverse. I want to make sure that our party reflects the communities that we hope to represent. And that means that we have to have members in our party, and we have to have candidates in our party that are going to look like the British Columbia that we see today. And that's something I'm really excited about, because I think that it gives us the opportunity to ensure and go out and recruit some great Persian, South Asian, Chinese candidates that can run for the party. And that's something that I'm taking personal responsibility for. And I am going to be personally out there encouraging people to get involved in the party. So that's a long answer. I apologize, but it covered a lot of territory.
I appreciate that. But in terms of housing and gas, high price of gas issues that you mentioned, I believe these issues were also existed when the BC Liberal Party were in power. What would you do differently to actually address these problems if you take over the power, and considering the current board situation? I mean, the whole challenges.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that is true. In fact, when I announced my retirement from public life in 2012, the median price of housing was about $450,000. Today, it's well over $1 million. And you know, so it's gone dramatically higher since I left government. But even in, you know, when I was out of government, but even when the BC Liberals were still in government in 2015, 2016, that's really when we started to see prices start to increase. Now, the thing about housing to understand, and I come from a background in the housing sector, I know the sector very, very well, is that the way you have to change that, it can't happen overnight. But there are a lot of things the government can do that can make a big, big difference. And housing supply, as I mentioned earlier, is one of them. The problem we have is that we have local governments that are very, very slow in approving new supply coming into the market. And yet we know that we're going to have, you know, even during COVID, when we had no immigration at all for 2 years, virtually no foreign buyers in our market at all, prices still continued to rise. And the reason is that there's very, very little supply, and there's still a lot of demand from people looking for housing and different kinds of housing. Now, if you add in the 70 to 100,000 people a year that will be coming here as a result of immigration, as the borders open up now, where are all those people going to live? The first thing they do whether they're coming from Iran or India or the United States or Europe, it doesn't matter, Ukrainian refugees, the first thing they do when they get off a plane here in Vancouver is they say, I have to live somewhere. So they either have to rent or they've got to buy something. And so that puts a lot of demand on our marketplace. And unless government deals with that supply issue, we're never going to get ahead of the demand. So that's number one. But number two is there's lots of things we can do from a tax and public policy point of view that can make a big difference too. So I know, for example, that 25% of all the cost of new homes is taxes. It's the property transfer tax, it's the PST, it's the GST, it's community amenity contributions, it's development cost charges, it's public art charges. There's just a whole bunch of taxes that get charged. And that all gets passed on to consumers in the form of the price they pay. So that's why I say that what I want to do is look at all those costs, but look at them through the eyes of a first-time buyer, because I want to make sure that a person that's trying to get into the marketplace, that we eliminate a lot of those costs for them so they can see themselves having a credible chance of getting into the market. So those are the two big areas that I would look at.
Okay, thank you. This year, Canada faced protests by thousands of truckers participating in the so-called Freedom Convoy fighting COVID-19 mandates. And the protests that also spread to the provincial governments. Recently, the organizers of these protests have announced that they are heading to Victoria, and I believe they are arriving here as of today, March 14, and they are planning to stay here in Victoria for months. What do you make out of these protests all across Canada, including our province? Do you support them? And what steps do you believe that both federal and provincial government should take in response to these protests?
Sure. So look, this is a very important question. I always support the right of British Columbians to protest. That is a fundamental freedom that we all have. However, I also, more importantly, support the rule of law, which means that while we have the right to protest, we do not have the right to ignore laws and disobey the law. And I don't care whether it's convoy protesters or people that on a Friday afternoon think that they can block a bridge and shut down traffic because they want to protest the environment, or whether it's people that are, terrorizing workers on the Coastal GasLink pipeline. That is all unacceptable to me. So, for these protesters, I think the one thing I always say is, first of all, obey the law. So if they're really planning to try and shut down and park vehicles and not allow people to move in and out of Victoria or downtown Victoria, I think that's a very, very bad idea. I also think it's going to work against their cause, because people will just say, well, that's really stupid, and I can't believe they're doing it. So I don't think it helps them in their cause. But I also think we have to be a little bit careful not to be dismissive of all these folks, because oftentimes we've gone through a very difficult 2 years, and it's been very, very stressful. There are lots of people, not in government, by the way, because in government, they all have been collecting their paychecks and everything. There's really been very little change for people in government. But for a lot of people that have to work in the private sector, many have lost their jobs, they've lost their businesses, they've been really impacted very, very negatively. There's a lot of mental health issues that people are having to deal with. And so I just think there's a lot of frustration out there about everything. It's not just about the mask mandates. There's frustration about gas prices. There's frustration about the economic circumstances they find themselves in, the fact that they don't feel like government's listening to them. And I always caution people, leaders in government, about being too dismissive. Our job, as far as I'm concerned, is to try and bring people together, to lower the temperature, if you will, to try and not belittle people and call them stupid and say that whatever they're protesting is not important. I think we should be very careful about that, because it's been a very challenging 2 years for a lot of the population. And so I don't want to be dismissive, but I would encourage them to obey the law and don't do things that are going to actually really undermine whatever support they have out there, because it'll work against their interest.
Okay, great. In general, how do you assess federal and provincial government's response to COVID-19 pandemic?
I think the federal government, for the most part, got it right. They flooded the zone, if you will. It's a hockey term, you know, when you send a lot of players on the ice, but they kind of flooded the zone with money at a time when they needed to. So they supported British Columbians and Canadians across the country with CERB payments, and that ensured that people were not going to be freaked out about whether they could pay their rent or pay their mortgage or what have you, especially if they lost their jobs. And they also provided some important support for some tenants in you know, across the country that were concerned about lease payments when they couldn't operate their businesses, et cetera. It wasn't perfect, the supports, but for the most part, I think they got it right. Provincially, frankly, it's been extremely disappointing, because what's happened provincially is we had an NDP government, because none of them come from a business background, they don't even understand what the problems businesses were facing. And so they, you know, it took them almost a year before they came out with a program to support small business. It was a $300 million fund. They said that you could apply for a grant of up to $10,000 originally. This is their plan. And but you had to fill out like a 30-page application, and you know, most businesses didn't even bother. And so literally we had a situation in BC where you had a government trying to give away free money, and they couldn't even do that because a lot of the businesses said it's not worth our time to even fill that out. And so they started making changes, and they increased the grant, and they tried to simplify the application process. But to be honest with you, it was way too little, way too late. And it was not based on any understanding of how a business really operates. If you're a restaurant, especially in anywhere here in the Lower Mainland, you know, your $10,000, it's not even going to cover 1 month of your lease payments, much less all your employees and your food costs, etc. So they missed an opportunity to really help out small business, and sadly, many of them have already lost their businesses and are gone forever. Some are still struggling and could use help, but they're not getting the right kind of help. The other thing that I think the government could have done better is they you know, and I've been saying this since I've been leader, they've not given us appropriate timelines so that people can plan. So for example, you remember on New Year's Eve, they just announced literally late in the afternoon of that day, no more New Year's Eve parties, and you know, we're putting back restrictions in place in terms of how many people can gather, et cetera. Well, that caused like massive layoffs of people. There was literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of food that went to waste because suddenly everything was canceled. They did it again on St. Patrick's Day, which is another big celebratory day for people like me that come from an Irish background. You know, they canceled that again late in the day. So what we've been saying to the government is there has to be clear timelines so that people can plan. Businesses can plan, families can plan. We've pushed them very hard on that, and I am pleased to see that they came out and said, okay, we're getting rid of the mask mandate, and we're going to look at removing the vaccine passport mandate, you know, on April 8th. So at least they're providing timelines so that families and businesses can start to plan around that, because the uncertainty that's created when they're making decisions at the last second are not helpful at all. So I think federally they did pretty good. I think provincially there was a lot of improvement that could have been done.
Long delays in admitting patients to hospitals is one of the most important issues in our province, especially in the last 2 years due to COVID. And many people are disappointed with the lack of specialists. While a lot of foreign physicians have been stopped from working in their own profession, as they are struggling with the professional credentials assessment. That's been a big obstacle, and a lot of immigrants are challenging with that. Why do you believe this issue has not been resolved yet, despite the fact that has been raised and discussed numerous times during the past years?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And this is where my experience as a former health minister and someone that was involved in government, even back in our day, I remember we put in special government or special dollars for foreign credentials recognition so that we could get people focused on recognizing foreign credentials and speeding up the process of allowing foreign credentialed professionals to be able to practice here in BC. But it's still not good enough. And I tell you, as a former health minister, I'm so frustrated with the entire process that I would do big changes. Because what's happening, a lot of that blocking is happening in the College of Physicians and Surgeons, if you're talking medical, where it is just unacceptable that we have foreign trained doctors. By the way, many of them trained at very prestigious universities around the world. This is not like, you know, some unknown university somewhere that no one's ever heard of. These are highly trained individuals, including that have attended Ivy League colleges in the United States that still have difficulty practicing in British Columbia. And to me, that's just so unacceptable that I want to look at the entire structure of the College of Physicians and Surgeons and sit down with those people. They're very good people. I know them well, and say it's not working and it's going to change. And you're either going to work with me so that we make this change happen in a very quick and efficient way, or I'll make the changes for you. But it is going to change because I'm not prepared to spend another 10 years watching and everyone saying, oh yes, we're going to make it better when it's not getting better. We can't afford to. The other thing I see happening, Seema, I've traveled across the province. I have never, in all my time that I was in government, and I was in government for 12 years prior to retiring in 2012, I've never seen the healthcare system in worse shape than it is today. And I mean that sincerely. This is not about politics. This is about people. And it's not even just about COVID. It's about every doctor and nurse and frontline staffer that I've spoken to is just so tired of the system. It's inefficient. It's not responding to their needs. They're unhappy. They're feeling burnt out. They don't want to practice anymore. The system keeps forcing them to do overtime when they don't want to anymore. But because the system has so little capacity, it can't even handle, minor surges that are created when you have something like COVID. Instead, we're canceling tens of thousands of surgical procedures, and people are, finding it very hard to get those procedures back on track. We have no idea how many lives could be lost or people that could be much sicker as a result of all those delays. So I am really, really concerned about this. This is a big problem for British Columbia, and we have got to have some leadership. And it's not just about more money. It is about how we treat our workforce, how we deliver the services. There's a whole bunch of areas that we're going to have to look at that I intend to be very aggressive on.
Thank you for that. And what was the obstacle to address this issue when you were the health minister?
The major obstacle was within the college, because it's a self-regulating college. And what that means is that they have the ability to define the rules for which people can practice in British Columbia. And, my concern is that what it's become is more of a protectionist system that kind of protects people here and makes it really difficult for people, that have been trained, especially if they've been trained at a medical institution outside of British Columbia or outside of Canada. They're all treated as foreign trained doctors, for example, or nurses. And to practice here is very difficult because there's not enough positions made available for foreign trained doctors. And so what we have to do is we've got to change all that. And it's a complex system because it's national in scope too. There's some national elements to it too. But in my view, this is where we've just got to stop the excuses and just get on with helping folks. At a time when we desperately need trained medical professionals, whether it's doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, licensed practical nurses, whatever the case may be, we should be doing everything we can to streamline them into the system. We should provide mentoring, for them so that if they practice slightly differently in their country of origin, that they learn how to do things here. But it's a streamlined process so that we're actually getting them into the system quickly. They're mentored and provided support until such time as they've got the competencies to practice under our system. But we can do that. We just have to have the leadership that says it's going to happen, and it will not be without some controversy.
Thank you. Okay, Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we all heard about the great response, both from your party and BCNDP, supporting Ukrainians in our province, as well as putting sanctions on Russian government's supporters in here. Also, your party called on BC government to inform the federal government that BC stands ready to welcome Ukrainian refugees. There is no doubt that these are all great actions and heartwarming. However, this raises a question among Afghan immigrants in BC, as well as Iranian community who share the same language with them, that why there wasn't such a response to the Taliban taking over Afghanistan last summer, where Canada was directly involved and was in the country, and a lot of Afghans helped Canadians in that country and basically jeopardized their lives. But they didn't receive, they were not offered same support as Ukrainians, like such as extension of the visit, temporary visas, study and work permits.
I think it's a shame on our country, to be honest with you. And I don't say that lightly, but I think it's a shame on the United States and Canada. These are more federal issues, as you know, in determining refugees and creating the opportunities for them to come into Canada. But I think it is a tragedy of real note, particularly for a lot of the women in Afghanistan that Canada and the United States trained, supported to help create some equality there where there was very little before, and created educational opportunities for young girls. And my heart goes out to all of them that are suffering now, and that are, reverting to a system, frankly, that is horribly unjust, especially for women and girls, but frankly for the entire country. And I just feel like the response from around the world was totally inadequate. It was almost like, let's get the heck out of here as quickly as we can. And I think we've done a disservice to a lot of the folks that were very, very supportive of us. And I think it is a shame on our country. I say that honestly. I mean, I don't speak for the federal government, but just me as a Canadian, as I watched all that unfold, I think it's very tragic. But so we've now got a situation in the Ukraine where we've got a horrible illegal invasion, with, once again, we're seeing this awful death and destruction, mass bombings and all the rest of it going on. A lot of people don't realize that Canada is actually the largest, the largest Ukrainian community outside of the Ukraine is actually in Canada. We have a historic relationship with Ukraine, and have brought and welcomed Ukrainians to Canada for decades and decades. They've made a great contribution to our country. And I want to make sure that the 2.5 million, probably closer to 3 million people in the next couple of weeks that are displaced and may never be able to go back to Ukraine, depending on what happens in that war, that we do our bit. Now, that's up to the federal government, of course, because they're in charge of immigration. They're in charge of making those decisions. But I wanted to make sure that our government was letting them know that in BC, we'd like to be part of the solution. But it's got to be more than just saying that. We need to actually get to work right now and start identifying where are places, where are there homes that could offer up rooms, to house these folks. Like, that work should be happening now. Where can we start to gather the kind of financial supports and food and clothing and all the other things that are going to be required? We should be working with a lot of the Ukrainian community here in BC that is trying to gather that kind of information and support so that we can be ready when some of these people start arriving.
Okay, thank you very much. And our last question, over 2 years have passed from the tragedy of shooting down the Ukrainian plane. And considering the fact that there were many victims of that flight who were the residents of this province, and considering the significant population, Iranian population and taxpayers in this province, and the fact that families of the victims and the whole community would like to build a monument to honoring the victims of this flight. Would you support the idea of building such a monument in the capital city of the province, or at least installing a plaque in the Legislative Assembly?
Yeah, look, without knowing where it should go, because I think I'd want to talk to the Persian community about that. But yes, I would very much support that. That was a horrific, I think we're talking about flight 572, I think it was, that was shot down. And, you know, as someone who lives in North Vancouver, and so many of those families, you know, came from the North Shore, and it was horrific what happened. And the loss of, not just the loss of lives, but the incredible loss of talented, unbelievably vibrant individuals that had so much contribution to make to this country, and were making, is just incalculable. So I would very much support some kind of memorial or recognition of those Canadians who, you know, Iranian Canadians who, through no fault of their own, were shot down. And that was a horrible, horrible tragedy. And there is also, you know, for the remaining family members, I do believe there is still, I believe a judgment was made against the government of Iran for financial compensation to those remaining family members that I hope gets followed through on, though that will not do anything to, you know, take away the incredible loss of life. But yes, I would be very supportive of a memorial. I just think that should happen anyhow. And I should also think about where, you know, even in North Vancouver, it would be nice if we could do something there where there is a large Persian population, that you know, it would be perhaps even closer and easier to access for, you know, quiet moments of reflection.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, we appreciate your time. We know you are busy, and appreciate the time you took to be with us this morning. Just to close it, Mr. Falcon, in this spring, this Nowruz, what are you looking forward to?
Well, you know, hopefully the peace and happiness that we hope to see, you know, with Nowruz. And you know, it's a challenging world, but as I remind people, you know, it's always a challenging world. Somewhere there's always going to be some problems. You know, when I was in government, we had SARS, we had H1N1, we had, you know, global economic, you know, meltdown that took place in 2008, 2009. Now we've got COVID. Now we got a war in Ukraine. You got the challenges in Afghanistan. You've got, you know, Iran nuclear weapons. There's all kinds of challenges out there, but we should never forget the important values of freedom and democracy and liberty and equality and all the things that we take for granted. I think sometimes when we see what's happening around the world, it's a reminder to all of us that we need to defend those important values wherever we are and whatever we do. And, you know, I hope that this year we'll see more peace and friendliness and brotherly love around the world and sisterly love around the world, so that we can all raise our children in a better world and leave them something that's a lot better than what we inherited. That would be my hope.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for all the
Thank
help,
you.
and especially the background technical people.